Perched like a narrow blade on Africa's western coast, Togo is bordered by Ghana to the west, Benin to the east, Burkina Faso to the north, and the Gulf of Guinea to the south. Though modest in size, its history is remarkably deep and complex, shaped by conquest, colonialism, and enduring struggles for democracy. Today, we explore Togo's post-independence journey. In 1884, German envoy Gustav Nachtigal signed treaties with local chiefs establishing the Togoland Protectorate. Lome was made the capital in 1897, and over the next 2 decades, the Germans developed railways, ports, and plantation agriculture. Though celebrated in Berlin as a model colony, or, more commonly, master colonie, German economic interests were prioritized over local well-being. By the time World War I came about, it changed everything. In 1914, British and French troops invaded and occupied Togoland, forcing Germany to relinquish their claim to the territory in 1919. Togoland was split, the western zone going to Britain and the eastern part to France. By 1922, both colonies were formally mandated to the respective colonial powers by the League of Nations. French Togo was later integrated into French West Africa, and while some infrastructure and education expanded, local control remained distant. After World War II, French Togo gained limited political representation in Paris, and a local assembly was formed. In 1946, the move towards independence accelerated when both territories became UN trusteeships. A decade later, in 1956, British Togoland voted to join the Gold Coast, which became Ghana in 1957. The French Togoland opted for autonomy, setting the stage for full sovereignty. On April 27, 1960, Togo achieved independence with Sylvanus Olympio as its first president. Olympio was a charismatic nationalist sought to build a self-reliant Togo, distancing the new republic from the French economic dominance. He curtailed foreign military ties and adopted a strict economic plan focused on domestic growth and fiscal discipline. But not everyone agreed with his vision. One of Olympio's most consequential decisions was his refusal to integrate hundreds of ex-servicemen who had fought in the French colonial army. For these jobless soldiers, Olympio's policies felt like betrayal. On January 13, 1963, just 3 years after independence, Olympio was assassinated during a military coup. Among the conspirators was a young sergeant named Gnassingbé Eyadema. Following the coup, power was handed to Nicholas Grunitzky, a moderate who promised reconciliation and stability. But Grunitzky's government was weakened by internal divisions, regional tensions, and public dissatisfaction. On January 13, 1967, exactly 4 years after Olympio's assassination, Eyadema struck again. This time, he seized the presidency for himself, suspended the constitution, and outlawed all political parties. With total power and control in his hands, Eyadema nationalized the country's prized phosphate industry in 1974, using the resulting state revenue to build a vast patronage system that bolstered his authority. His party, the Rally of the Togolese People (RPT), became the single dominant force. Elections were held but were largely ceremonial. The opposition was suppressed. While infrastructure and rural development projects were undertaken, the economic benefits rarely reached the broader population. Eyadema cultivated a cult of personality, styling himself as the embodiment of national unity. But beneath the surface, dissent simmered. In 1986, a group of exiled opponents attempted an armed incursion from Ghana. Though the plot failed, it underscored the growing unrest. Around the same time, global phosphate prices collapsed, plunging Togo into an economic crisis. With failing revenues, mismanagement, and rising corruption, the regime's resilience was tested. As democratic movements swept across Africa in the early 1990s, Eyadema was pressured to reform. he introduced a new constitution in 1992, legalizing opposition parties and promising democratic elections. But in practice, little changed. Eyadema won the 1993, 1998, and 2003 elections, each concluded by accusations of fraud, voter suppression, and violence. Human rights abuses were rampant, particularly in the Ewe majority south where opposition remained strong. International observers condemned many of these elections, but sanctions were limited and ineffectual. In 2003, Eyadema removed presidential term limits through a constitutional amendment, clearing the way for yet another term. But his rule came to a sudden end 38 years after taking power on February 5, 2005. He died while en route for medical treatment abroad. In a swift and controversial move, the military installed his son, Faure Gnassingbé, as president, violating the constitution's succession protocol. Under intense international and regional pressure, Faure briefly stepped down but returned weeks later through a heavily contested election. The post-election violence was devastating. Though Faure had officially secured the presidency, the legitimacy of his mandate was deeply tarnished. In a bid to reform his image and restore confidence, Faure launched the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission in 2009 to investigate political violence dating back to 1958. The same year, he dissolved the RPT and created a new party, the Union of the Republic, UNIR. Pretty much the same old people with just a new name and a new face hiding behind the masks. Elections in 2010 and 2015 were declared relatively free by some international observers, but they were fiercely disputed by opposition leaders like Jean-Pierre Fabre. Allegations of voting rigging, media bias, and intimidation marred both contests. Still, Faure maintained control. By 2017, discontent reached a tipping point. A coalition of 14 opposition parties, dubbed C14, launched mass protests demanding the restoration of presidential term limits and that they apply retroactively to Faure's presidency. The government responded by proposing reforms but made sure the new limits would not affect Faure's previous terms, allowing him to seek re-election. Protests intensified, security forces cracked down, arrests mounted, and in 2018, regional leaders including Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo and Guinea's Alpha Condé stepped in to mediate. ECOWAS presented a reform roadmap, but its implementation was sluggish. That year, the opposition boycotted parliamentary elections, enabling UNIR to consolidate a 4/5 majority in the National Assembly. In 2019, the legislature reinstated term limits, but again, they were not applied retroactively. Faure now had a legal path to run again, and he did. In 2020, he was re-elected with over 70% of the vote. His main challenger, former Prime Minister Adeyomi Kojo, rejected the results and was later forced into hiding. As in previous cycles, accusations for electoral fraud and intimidation were widespread. Come 2022, Togo joined the Commonwealth, signaling a strategic shift to broaden its international partnerships beyond Francophone countries. But the most significant political development came in 2024. The National Assembly passed sweeping constitutional reforms. The presidency was reduced to a ceremonial role, and a new position, the President of the Council of Ministers, was created to wield executive power. Critics argued that the move was tailored to allow Faure to remain in control beyond constitutional limits. From Olympia's dream of economic independence to Eyadema's decades-long authoritarian rule, followed by his son Faure's calculated political maneuvering, Togo's post-independence history is a case study in power consolidation and dynastic continuity. Though democratic institutions exist, genuine political pluralism remains elusive.